All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Swarm Webinar. We are going to be presenting tonight a little bit about our learnings from the Swarm training from the INE Institute that a couple of us DSN leaders went to in November. I'm just Grady-Benson. I'm the Director of Training with the Divestment Student Network, and we've got a bunch of folks on tonight from the DSN who attended the training with me, and I'll have them introduce themselves now, starting with Varshini. If you could just say your name and your role, that would be great.
Hi everyone, my name is Varshini Prakash and I am the Regional Networks Coordinator with the Divestment Student Network. And I'll kick it to Sachi.
I got it. I'm Sachi. I'm the coordinator for the People of Color Caucus, and I also help coordinate the reinvestment project.
I'll kick it to Jason.
Hello, I'm Jason, and I am the DSN's Grassroots Fundraising Coordinator, and I'm representing fundraising on a program support team. And that's all.
Awesome. Thank you all for being on to share some learnings from this training. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, the reason that we're holding this webinar tonight is, first of all, because we attended the Swarm training in November because we believed it to be a really important opportunity to learn about how we could increase the effectiveness of our organization through something called decentralization and a particular methodology of incorporating decentralization into our organization, and think that this is really has a lot of possibilities for implementation in terms of where we're going next in our long-term strategy process. And so the training was really focused on decentralization as a means to increase the efficacy and the power of movements and organizations by creating more autonomy, more creativity in our structures and functions. So tonight we're going to be doing a little bit of a teach-in on some of the core. We'll open it up to talk a little bit about that we see these learning in the DSN. Place for you all to ask us questions. And for you who are just watching through the live stream link, there is a question and answer box, so make sure that you send us your questions through that. We're also going to be having Lissy join us from the INE Institute. She's running a little bit late, but she'll be here to help us out with some of the questions that y'all might have towards the end of our time together. So with that, we'll get started. And I just want to start off by framing a little bit of what centralization and decentralization means. First of all, for those of you who are on with us tonight, what have about the term centralization? What comes up when you think about decentralization? Is that term familiar to any of you, or do you have any particular associations with what decentralization means in a movement context in particular? Maya, what are you thinking about when you think of decentralization?
Wait, can you hear me? Okay, I couldn't tell if I was muted or unmuted before. Yeah, when I think of decentralization, I think a lot of, to me it actually kind of rings a bell of like hyper-organization, not in a negative way, but I think a lot of like what I've heard being called like the snowflake structure, so like having a lot of different groups and having point people to represent each of them, like that's the most, I guess the way I have a really visual image when I think of decentralization, and that's what comes to mind.
Awesome. Yeah, the snowflake model is a really visual example of how I first learned about decentralization as well when I was first starting to organize around divestment. What do other folks think of when they think of decentralization?
I feel like something that I think, and I like continue to think and like have to work to not think sometimes, is like that decentralization lacks structure or doesn't have a structure, or is like consistently messy, or like kind of gives me a little internal anxiety because I'm like, who's in charge? And so, yeah, those are some of the reactions that I have when I hear decentralization.
Totally. Yeah. So I know that personally I had a lot of assumptions going into this training about what decentralization and centralization meant. That, first of all, decentralization at its worst was chaotic and unstructured and ineffective, and centralization at its worst was overly hierarchical, could really create negative structures of power and limit other people's ability to be a part of leadership. And so a lot of those assumptions were actually debunked in this training, which I found really useful. So the INE Institute actually defines centralization as the process by which information, planning, and decision-making in an organization become concentrated within a particular location or group, such that all important decision-making powers are concentrated at the center or the head of the organization. Decentralization, they define as the process of redistributing or dispersing functions, powers, people, information, or resources away from a central location or authority within the organization. So it's really about where the power is held in particular and how decisions are made. And it has a lot to do with the structure. Something that I found incredibly useful about the way that they describe centralization and decentralization is that these are dynamics. And neither is either good nor bad, and these dynamics exist in a spectrum. So we can think of the most extreme examples of centralization and decentralization being centralized organization looking like the military, right? Incredibly structured, incredibly hierarchical, and power held at the center of the organization, versus Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a very decentralized organization that's organized around a set of principles or beliefs and practices, but there is no leadership whatsoever. And it plays out in various contextual groups, right? So it exists on a spectrum. And our organization, like other movement organizations, also exists within the spectrum of centralization and decentralization. And decentralization is everywhere. We see it in movements particularly like Black Lives Matter and Occupy, in industries and businesses, in networks, and also in ecosystems. And the Swarm training, though it emphasized that neither decentralization nor centralization is better, Swarm really focused on decentralization because they believe that decentralized movement building can allow for the maximum creativity and autonomy of the organizers in our movements, thus allowing them to grow more exponentially. So the INE Institute says, to bring any single project to scale with integrity, we need to harness the intelligence of everyone involved. We believe popular movements are bigger and stronger when they self-organizing through principles of decentralized organization. So we digged into a variety of reasons why we decentralize and how we can do that across the spectrum and in your context when that's most appropriate. So some of the reasons that we decentralize are to adapt to context. We already know this in the DSN, that we actually have regional networks that play out our various narratives based on core tenets of our story in conjunction with what's going on the ground in those regions. So, for example, the Southwest Network is really developing their regional narrative around the actual struggles around ecological justice in the Southwest, building relationships with Black Mesa Water Coalition, talking about drought, talking about extraction in Colorado and Arizona, etc. Decentralization also allows for self-management, autonomy, and maximum creativity, and that sounds pretty good to me. And everything is changing really fast. Rooted in ecological thinking, the Swarm methodology really talks about how we can be mirroring the natural world to understand the growth and the structure of our movements. So I'm going to pass it on to Varsh, who's going to talk a little bit more about that concept.
Awesome, thanks. So something that we found really compelling about this particular training was that the training talked about technological, like massive technological shifts that are happening in the world, and also ecological deregulation that's happening in the world as well, as two of the biggest reasons why decentralization is gaining momentum. So we think about technological shifts like social media and just like technology in general is just changing at such a rapid pace and is also decentralizing at like phenomenal rates as well. And ecological deregulation is something that we as the DSN know super well. We're talking about like climate change. We're talking about ecological changes in our lives that we feel in our bodies and affect us without us even necessarily being aware of it or knowing it. So things that grounded us before, like land, access to land, water, food, shelter, those things that were constants are like quickly becoming less stable and predictable, particularly for this generation and for generations to come. And so when we say ecological thinking is at the root of this methodology, actually the Swarm training was really amazing for all of us to be a part of, because we were like, oh, damn, like people are actually thinking about ecological regulation as the foundation of all of the change in the system that's happening as a whole, and actually is a huge thing that we have to contend with to fight any of these overlapping and interwoven crises that we're trying to fight as social justice activists. And so this was actually a huge learning for us as DSN folks being in this training. There was actually a specific moment where one of the trainers said, if you want to understand more about ecological deregulation and what's actually happening in the world, talk to the DSN. And we realized, we were like, damn, people actually want to talk to us about what it means to fight for ecological justice in the world. And we were like, we haven't even thought about this necessarily, or access like what it like access our power around what it means to talk about this narrative as an organization. So this was actually a huge learning moment for me, being like, we have a huge opportunity that we might be missing right now to actually talk about how ecological justice and ecological deregulation and this like chaos and commotion that exists in the world right now is actually hugely applicable to social movements and hugely applicable to how we conceive of solutions to our crises. And so that's actually something that I'm really curious about what people think about on this call. And yeah, I'm sort of wondering a lot of, like, to share a little bit about my own stories, like a lot of how I felt, why I came into divestment organizing was I came in as like a pure environmentalist at the beginning. You know, I was like super into recycling. I was like really into trees. I like loved the environment. And then I came into this organizing, and people were like, it's not about the environment, it's about people. Like, we gotta like distance ourselves as much as possible from like the conceptions of tree hugger or like these sort of like derisive ways that people talk about environmentalists, and also like in a way environmentalists have created for themselves. And yeah, and I went kind of the other way where I was like, screw the environment, like I don't want to talk about the environment at all. And now I'm coming back to sort of a middle place, like a homeostasis between the two different like a balance between these two, between people, nature, environment, land, all of these things. And I'm curious about, yeah, how have people on this call approached balancing these different things between people and planet and the world that we live in and the land that we live on and the resources that we need for survival, and also the like people that we need for community and social nourishment and survival as well. I'm curious about how have people pulled those concepts into their own organizing. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or thoughts on anything in this section? Also, I just want to hear what people think. Anybody? Becca, do you have any thoughts? I know you think about this. Okay, no.
Can you ask the question again? I missed the end of it.
No, totally. I mean, sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. It's good.
It's
good facilitation.
No, I was just curious about if you had any thoughts on what it means for the DSN or for climate justice groups to really own this understanding of ecological justice and to own it in our narrative, to own it in the way that we approach our work, and also in the way that we talk about who we fight for and what we fight for. Yeah.
I mean, you could write like 3 books about this. You should read Naomi Klein's book, but I think that for me, I think I was like for a long time as a student campaigner, I was embarrassed to like talk about how I like you were talking about, Barsh, like actually own how much like the environment and nature matter to me as a campaigner and why that's something that's worth preserving and not just preserving but fighting for. And I think figuring out ways to humanize the way that we talk about climate change and extraction and environmental degradation. And I think unfortunately there's like way too many opportunities right now to do that with the water crisis in Detroit and with the methane link in Southern California and with flooding in Alabama. And so I think over and over again there's these opportunities where there's so much space to talk about how climate change and environmental destruction are impacting working people every single day. And we have the opportunity as people who are comfortable with that language and know how to talk about climate change to make those links and tell those stories so that more people can do that. And I think we've already seen such a shift over the past 10 years. Like way more unions are like preparing to talk about what climate change means with their workers. And way more community organizations are. And so we have an opportunity as young people to keep pushing that wherever we go and making climate an issue that every organization is talking about and isn't kind of siloed to the single issue sphere.
Totally. Thank you. Thanks, Becca. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add to that? Welcome, Lissy. If we have one more comment, we can take one more comment and then we'll move on. Anybody?
I think for me, just hearing during the Swarm webinar, Carlos's unapologetic framing of ecological degradation as this foundation for why so many things in our world are changing so rapidly right now and how that's playing out and having such a ripple effect into people's needs not being met, into organizations in various different forms not functioning in the same way, is the kind of, I would love us to be able to embrace that narrative and own that with such an unapologetic tone and confidence. And I think that that's something that I really took away from being in that space and having the facilitators be like, you should ask the DSN about this, and then me being like, wow, do we really know how to talk about that in the way that we want to and that aligns with what we really believe? So yeah, thank you so much for describing that part.
Totally. Unapologetic. That's how I want to be about my ecological justice. Thank you. Cool. Well, that is it for my section. So I'm going to pass it to Jason.
Great.
Thanks, Bob.
Sorry, Jason. First, I want to just take a quick second to introduce Lissy or welcome Lissy into the call. Would you like to just take a minute and introduce yourself? Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. I am sorry that you have to hear Starbucks in the background. I am listening to some sweet jazz tunes here. My name is Lissy, and I work with the INE Institute. And Carlos and I hosted the Swarm training in November. So I'm just here to support you. I think you're doing really exciting work, and just want to, if there's any questions that you all have about Swarm or decentralization, that's what I'm here for.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it on to Jason.
Thanks, Jess. So what I want to do is just very quickly run through some characteristics that are kind of required for decentralization, as described in the Swarm training. So I got 4 things. The first one is structure. So like it came up on our webinar so far, some people kind of assume, or I've even personally assumed, that like decentralization means no structure. But really, decentralized organization requires more structure than centralized organization to be successful. And the trick is that it's a really unique structure which allows for the maximum amount of autonomy within the boundaries. So, for example, you have like little small teams that have been trained and are then able to do kind of whatever they want to do, and they have the autonomy to do that, but it's like within the boundaries of the movement. And we'll talk about that more later when we talk about movement DNA, which I know is a new term we'll talk about later. So that's the first thing, is structure. The second thing is the boundaries. So the boundaries need to be explicitly defined so that the system knows how to sustain itself and avoid disease. So we're using some funny language, but you know, like interference that might happen or whatever. So an example of something that might happen to your movement is like the state or like the government's like, we don't like this and we're going to like shut this down. So if you're decentralized and you don't have really strong boundaries, it might be really difficult for you to deal with that interference. So that's the second thing. The third thing is roles. Roles need to be really explicit in decentralized organization. Basically, if someone doesn't have a role, then they are either not part of the organization or they don't know how to act within the organization. So the reason that the roles are so explicit is so that we can have a more accessible movement. One organization that we met at Swarm is called Cosecha, and Cosecha they told us they designed roles so that a full-time working mom could take on those roles. So they purposely made their movement or organization like really accessible to the people they want to be organizing. And one example of roles when we were at the Swarm training was actually all the participants got put into roles during the training. So I was on the logistics team and was one of 2 of the food people. So I was in the food person role, and my job and my role was like very explicit. Like I knew what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to make the coffee in the morning. I was supposed to refill the snacks, and I was supposed to clean up the food at night. You know, kind of some more stuff. But like I had a very clear role. It was like a very small role that was manageable for me, and I didn't have like a ton of management. Like I pretty much just kind of like did it. So that's roles. And then the last thing is kind of a little troika called vision, function, and values. And it's just important that an organization has a very clear vision, a clear function, and clear values. This is really necessary in order to scale the organization, to grow it with as much unity and autonomy as possible. And so this kind of fits into the idea of having like a movement ecosystem, which is just like a regular ecosystem, except instead of like organisms, we're talking about organizations. So it's thinking of organizations in a movement like organisms in an ecosystem. So like in a movement, a bunch of different organizations can have the same vision and different functions, and that's fine. And that creates like a very diverse, healthy movement ecosystem. So for example, like in the climate justice movement, the function of the reinvestment network is to win investment in community-owned solutions to the climate crisis. Like for example, a worker-owned cooperative. So like that's their function, right? The function of this network is to do that. While as the primary function of the Divestment Student Network is to strengthen the student divestment movement. So we kind of, you know, we are existing in the same movement, we're working towards the same ultimate vision, but we have different functions, and that's good, that's healthy. So those are just 4 characteristics that are really required kind of for decentralization, as we learned at the Swarm training. And I'll give it back to Jess now to talk about conditions that are necessary.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. And so Sachi's going to try and present a slide that will hopefully be useful here. So decentralization, as we've mentioned, is really a beneficial thing for popular movements in that it can create more autonomy and creativity amongst its participants, make it more accessible. However, decentralization, when it doesn't exist in the correct conditions, is not always right for your context. And so, for example, if you're in a movement where there isn't a clear understanding or unity around the kind of culture you want to create, the things you believe, the ways you want to take action, then it actually might not be great for everything to be decentralized, because it's really hard to change the culture of a movement in a very decentralized space. So at that point, centralization might be more effective, bringing people together, concentrating the intelligence of the participants, and creating some new DNA that you want to disseminate, right? So I'm going to go through a couple of the characteristics and conditions of decentralization that help make it successful. And they're kind of expanding upon some of the things that Jason just shared. So the first is management. In centralized organizations, you have very hierarchical management, sort of top-down power structures. In decentralized organization, self-management is the norm. And in order for this to actually work, the organization needs to have really clear objectives, really clear theory of change, and spectrum of tactics, meaning the different ways that you take action together. And if you don't have these things, then self-management can go awry, right? An individual can be like, well, I'm just going to do whatever, you know? And so if you don't have a clear understanding of the function, the objectives, and the way that you're strategizing in your organization or your movement, self-management isn't as effective, right? The second is culture. And in decentralized organizations, relational culture was particularly emphasized at the Swarm training. And culture is really the ways that we treat each other, the ways that we talk about ourselves, and the ways that we take action. So that manifests in various principles that we have, which kind of outline the rules of how we organize. Our language, and having a shared language is an important part of culture, and also our tactics, which is how we take action. And those are all rooted in a set of shared values. And so relational culture really emphasizes that relationships come first, and the way you produce together follows, right? And so relational culture can be manifested through a variety of practices. For example, storytelling, which increases vulnerability, and resonance through people's stories to show reciprocity and increase emotional connection and relationship strength amongst the participants in your organization. And so relational culture is really important for decentralization. Information and decision-making are also an important component. In a centralized organization, as we mentioned before, information and decision-making is really held at the head or in the center of the organization instead of distributed, right? And so decentralized organization really requires that there's clear decision-making and distributed decision-making and communication. And as Jason mentioned, explicit roles are really important both for accessibility, but also for clarity in what people are taking on, right? Something I really remember stuck out to me about the training was Carlos said, forget about self-care. We need more roles, and we need clearer roles. And so often I notice in our organizing that our roles are so vast and so complicated that it's hard to bring other people into work. It's hard to delegate, and it's also hard to have clear communication amongst our different work. So branches and roles being explicit and fluid, meaning that they're easily exchanged and delegated, is really helpful so that you can have clear, manageable roles and communication amongst different areas of work. So I'm going to leave that section there and pass it back to Jason to talk a little bit more about DNA and front loading.
Yes, thanks, Jess. Yes, so we talked already, I think, 2 times about this, but you know, it really, I think, is probably the most common misconception about decentralized organizing is it's anarchy. People can just do whatever they want, and it's a whole mess. And you can't control any of it. So Swarm taught us that it doesn't have to be like that, because the answer is something called DNA and front loading, which I know are like weird words that don't make any, you never heard before in organizing. But basically, it's not that difficult. DNA is just like, you know, biological DNA, right? Is like the core information, the biological information. The DNA is like the core information of the movement. It's like the story of the movement, the narrative. It's the strategy of the movement. Like what are you going to do, and then what are you going to do to get to where you want to go? And it's the structure of the movement. So how the movement is organized structurally. And So the DNA basically is created by a core of people before the movement really is even launched. And the process of creating that DNA, of coming together and like figuring that all out, is called front loading. So you're like loading up all the stuff in the front, like in the beginning, and then once you got it, then you launch it. So you got the DNA, you front loaded it, and then it gets launched. And so, for example, using the Divestment Student Network and the divestment movement as an example, the first divestment campaigns, right, were started by fossil fuel divestment campaigns, were started by students in solidarity with communities being affected by the fossil fuel industry. And they had like a really strong sort of justice narrative. So then 350.org became really interested in the campaign, and they engaged in something of a front-loading process to create DNA for a decentralized movement based on the divestment campaign. So the DNA was basically disseminated after it was all front-loaded through Bill McKibben and his writing, like the global warming's terrifying new math, right? Like that whole article that some of you have read in Rolling Stone about how much fossil fuel reserves there are, and if we burn them all, what would happen, and all that. Like that's all part of the DNA, right? That's part of the narrative of the movement. And the Do the Math tour, right? So through these basic, they're kind of like trainings. They're kind of like big trainings that happen all across the country. And you see, like they made the DNA, they front loaded it, and then they launched it, and then all these campaigns pop up, very decentralized manner, right? They just pop up, they got the DNA, they just roll with it. And so basically, 350.org and the DSN, this is a little bit complicated, but are both like centralized organizations, and they have decentralized components. So the divestment movement, like, was sort of created really big by front-loading DNA and then launching a decentralized movement by a centralized organization. And now the Divestment Student Network, you know, kind of has feelings like, well, we want to have more of like a justice narrative and blah, 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 blah. So we also created this centralized organization to try and like affect this decentralized movement. So that's a little bit about DNA and front-loading, but Sachi is going to talk more about front-loading.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, I'm going to share another slide really quick. Just give me 1 second here. It's okay. Can you all see that? So part of my experience of the Swarm training was going to a breakout session where two organizations that are using a Swarm-style decentralization and DNA process gave presentations and told stories about their experience. And that's, if not now, in Cosecha. And both of them went through a full front-loading process where they basically shut down operations and spent 12 to 18 months with a small, tight core group of people being incredibly intentional about crafting the DNA that they wanted to disseminate through the movement, their story, their structure, their strategies. And so they talked a lot about that process. What were the challenges? What were the successes? What were the different strategies? What were the moments where they had to reassess what they were doing and change their process? And it was extremely helpful. And also, it was clear to me that the DSN, as it exists right now, is not necessarily in a position to shut down operations for that amount of time. To do a full front-loading process. And I think that's true for the majority of the organizations that were at this training. And so the question becomes, how do we approach the Swarm, the DNA, the front-loading toolbox and figure out which tools, which degrees of application make the most sense for us, are most strategic to us as an organization in our movement context at this moment. And so on this slide, it's a little bit, it's very general, but I think it's one of the questions that we're considering now as an organization is, to what degree of integration do we want to engage this model? And so one lesson that was really important was that there can be parts of an organization or a movement that are in the process of centralizing, and there can be parts or branches of that organization or movement that are decentralizing. And we can treat different components of our organization as dynamic and open up space to have different managerial styles, have different decision-making processes, the types of elements that Jess reviewed. So this slide just walks through the different possibilities for what that might look like, with 1 degree being, okay, we're going to experiment with this model and we're going to take one component of our organization and consider what decentralization would look like in that branch and practice it and see what happens. And up to changing one department, many departments, a much more hybridized model, all the way up to 5 degrees, which would look like the majority of the organization is self-managing, and there's been enough front-loading to support that process, that we've taken the time to set up the structures, the story, the DNA, such that self-management can happen, and there's a deep level of alignment and trust around that. So we're in this moment right now of figuring out, as we bring this back and ask, what does this mean for our work and in our context, to consider the different degrees of integration and how we want to be engaging. I think that's it for right now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sach. So I know we just presented a lot of information, and thank you all for patiently absorbing all of that. I wanted to open up some space for Lissy to comment on or clarify or add to anything that we presented before we talk a little bit more about what this looks like in the context of our work in the DSN. Lissy, is there anything that you heard that you want to expand upon or dig a little bit deeper into?
No, I think you all are doing really, really great. Are there any questions that would make sense for me to answer now, or do you want to do that after?
I think we'll do questions in a little bit. I would love to hear, though, what's standing, for folks who are on with us right now, what's standing out to you out of the concepts that we've gone over thus far before we dig into a little bit more presentation. I hear Becca saying integration. Becca, do you want to say a little bit more about what's standing out to you about integration?
Yeah, it was just helpful to hear the breakdown of like how you can integrate it in different ways and levels, and that there are lessons from this theory to pull for a wide range of organizations and structures. So that was really helpful to hear broken down and made it feel more manageable to think about applying from like one program level versus like having to reconfigure an entire organization.
Definitely, definitely, definitely. I think that's super important, that there's actually like quite a bit of nuance in how we can approach using the learnings from Swarm. And there's so much that we brought back, and also want to acknowledge that what we're going over tonight with y'all is a fraction of what we got to throughout the weekend of training, and really want this to just serve as a foundation for us to start exploring what are some of the ways that we can improve the effectiveness of our structures, understand our function, our vision, our values more clearly, and think about where we're going in the long term, knowing that there is so much more to dig into here. What's one more thing that's standing out to folks? Maybe Maya and Silver as other participants?
This is stuff kind of from the very beginning, but that's really stuck with me throughout, is just the basic idea of this decentralization as maximizing creativity and autonomy, because I think I've usually thought of it as more like maximizing equality and like that, more like that. And so I think that's really interesting, especially in thinking of each of these characteristics and like kind of what should be the most decentralized and like when things need to be centralized as well, to figure out how to maximize that, like in tandem with all of these characteristics, just like that balance between decentralization, like in principle, but like mostly really maximizing autonomy as being the root of that.
Yeah, totally, totally. I think that's a really crucial point. And I am also hearing what you're saying, knowing when it's right to implement decentralization and like in what parts of the work that we're doing, what parts of our organization, and when centralization might actually be more what we need. And I think that that's where like the craft comes in, right? Of identifying what actually, what are we ready to really just disseminate, and what do we need to be more carefully crafting intentionally before we take it to scale. Silver, do you have anything to add at this moment?
No, I kind of agree with both what Maya and Becca mentioned. Those are the things that stick out to me as well.
Cool. Awesome. So now we're going to take a second to talk a little bit more about how all of us who attended this training are thinking about it in the context of our work in the DSN. Knowing that there's so much here, what does it actually look like coming back from the weekend in Boston and starting to implement some of our learning, starting to contend with some of the questions that we have. So I'd love to pass it to Sachi and then Jason to talk a little bit about what y'all have been mulling over after the training in relation to your work.
Something that I've been thinking about since we started the DSN is just how to cohere an organization and a movement across geographies and through technology, when so much of that is the lens for our organizing. And I think something that was really clear to me at the Swarm training was that the DNA work is the organizational glue. It's what creates the kind of the bonds of what holds your organization together, but actually people and the relationships we have with each other is what gives all of that DNA, all that front-loading work, life and power and potency. And I think that's especially relevant to our organizational context of having young organizers who are brand new to the movement spread across distance. And so the emphasis on relational organizing and having the relational center there and actually having us engage in a practice of being connected to each other through storytelling and through more than just this sort of like our work as it exists on paper was really, really significant to me and something I've been thinking about a lot. When the majority, not the majority, but many, many people that I organize with very closely I've never met in person, and how critical those connections are to holding all of us together when things get hard or when we're facing shifting conditions and all of that, that it's that relationship building that actually allows us to trust each other, be dynamic organizers, and shift what we're doing as needed, and show up for each other as things are hard. So that was really important to me. And I can pass it to Jason.
Yeah, so I am really, really excited about the vision, function, and values concept. We actually went as the DSN in front of the room during that section of the training and like had to like live figure out our vision and function and values as the DSN, and it was so much fun. And I definitely was like, you know, I feel like we're really clear on divestment, and we're really getting pretty good at that. But it's like, what's next? You know, like I really feel like we have a lot of different ideas about that, and we just haven't really gotten it super clear. So I'm just so excited about the possibility of doing that now. But also more specifically about like the idea of decentralization and decentralized organizing. I'm very excited about that generally. I'm really excited about centralized organization, but I'm also really excited about decentralized organization. And one thing that I'm thinking about is the possibility of using both of those, either in the same organization or if not, like just in the same movement. You know what I mean? But like kind of somehow networked or work together. And like one example that really inspires me is like the Indian National Congress, which was a really centralized political party, and the Indian Freedom Movement, which is like a totally decentralized grassroots movement. but they like totally work together to overthrow the British colonial rule in India and take state power, and at the same time like totally change people's hearts and minds. And I just think that's such like a powerful historical example of centralization and decentralization. So I'm just really excited about how they can work together. So I'll give it to Jess.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason and Sachi. Yeah, I don't even really know where to start. I have been thinking a lot about all these concepts in relation to the long-term strategy process of the DSN, in relation to the trainings program as it emerges in the DSN, and also just the culture of our movement in general. In relation to the long-term strategy process, Allison, who's coordinating that currently, was not able to make it on tonight, but to enlighten a little bit about where we're going with this, a lot of the SWARM methodology is hugely applicable to the way that we approach our long-term strategy and how we understand the process of creating a culture and a DNA, really, to move us into the next phase of the DSN as an organization and as a movement building organization. And so it is definitely one of the major tools in our toolbox. And I know Allison is really excited about exploring what it looks like to create a hybrid model of front loading that works with the DSN. And so that'll be something that we dig into more along the way, and she'll be able to talk more about that. I've been thinking a lot about what it looks like to implement some of the tools from this training into our training programs, and particularly some of the relational components of using storytelling and resonance are something we've already started experimenting with in training spaces, and am really excited about intentionally crafting a culture for training spaces that can be replicated and contextualized across the country in various parts of our networks. So really thinking about using some of the smaller degrees of this front-loading or implementation process in individual trainings, but also looking to how trainings are one of the major ways that we disseminate culture in movements, and how can we be using our training program to be at the service of creating a more effective DNA and culture in the DSN and the divestment movement in the future. So those are just some of the few things that I'm thinking about. And now I would love to open it up to hear what you all are thinking about. What's coming up for you about your work in the divestment movement in relation to these concepts? Whether that's questions or reflections, love to hear what's swirling for you. And I also just want to remind folks who are watching on the broadcast technology that you can use the question and answer to send us your thoughts. And if that's not working for any reason, just chat me at jgrady-benson@gmail.com.
Sorry. One thing I've been thinking about a lot with like relational culture, a lot in working with the Lower New England region, is like kind of really trying to figure out ways to build those relationships in a decentralized organization when we have these clear boundaries and we have these teams. Like, so there's building relationships within those teams, but how can we facilitate more relationships beyond that when it comes down to it? You know, we're all working towards the same goals and there are overlap. Like how, and that's where like I think the fluidity that we talked about in terms of like boundaries and roles in some way, shape, or form, like to have that real trust between those roles that may not necessarily have direct work all the time. So that's something we've been thinking about a lot in the Lower New England network, because we're just kind of this like regional network trying to figure our stuff out. And so like, and like in doing that, like we just really realized finding more ways to work together and like do stuff in our region has been really beneficial, and like kind of really needing something to talk, just having places to bring people together and talk and get to know each other. And like even this space is really awesome. because you guys are a bunch of people I don't talk to all the time, but I'm really curious about all your thoughts on these things. And so I wonder how maybe training or other spaces could be used to facilitate more relationship building between people that may not always be connected.
I think that's a really great point, and I think it touches a lot on what Sachi was saying about building relationships and movements across distance, and the nature of our work being very much online and sometimes feeling very isolated. So I think trainings and in-person space to bring folks together is definitely one way, and I'm really excited about future convergences and trying to get more people learning together in the same place, and also using more webinar spaces like this to have discussions about direction of our organization, about campaign strategy, political education, opportunities as a way to bring people together as well. I'm curious what other folks on this call think, and I would love to hear Lissy also, if y'all are navigating that challenge in your work with If Not Now and also with INE. What are some ways that you're exploring relationship building across smaller groups of people who have shared work?
How we're exploring building relationships across small groups of people who have shared work.
Yeah, so knowing that often in like a decentralized network, you have tight-knit groups of people who often have communication, but that getting to know people across those spaces or in different parts of your network can be challenging. And I know y'all are just getting started in expanding with If Not Now, but what's been your experience doing that and the work that you've been part of?
I mean, I think like you said, we're really just getting started with it. I think the primary tool that we learned the hard way that we had to use on our core team was the resonating tool. And then once people went to the relational centers, train the trainers, I think that their understanding really deepened. I think that tool is really useful, and I really want to learn more about the other tools that they have. I think it's an amazing tool, and we also need to like expand our repertoire, but I think that they have a lot of thinking about how very practical ways to seed a culture of like interdependence and depth. And so I think that was really transformative for our group to, I mean, once we learned that, I mean, our retreats were typically 2 days, and then we started making them all 3 days, and the whole first day would be relational work. So that means 30% of our retreats would be relational work. And we discovered that halfway through, after there seemed to be like intractable differences between people that no longer were I mean, it was kind of like magic. So I think that that's one of the practices that we're using in If Not Now. And then I think the other ways that people have to connect across groups, people are grounded in their circles, but then people have opportunities to connect across groups in their like village meetings. So that's where circles come together and people connect around different roles, or people can connect more regionally. But we really haven't, I mean, that's what we're planning to use, but we haven't even had the occasion yet to see how that functions. The only way that we've seen it is that we did a tea for tea of people from all different cities. And I think that the relational work, and I think also looking at internalized oppression and stuff was really, really important for us. So to look at the very specific reasons that would keep a person from taking a stand. So I think when you guys were talking about a training program, I think that another thing that can really bind people is like a common experience and a common language of looking at like, what do we have to overcome in ourselves to face all of our discouragement about the climate? Like, what does it really take for us to believe that we can do something about this? And whatever are the things that you all already know from trying to organize people, keep people from being awake and engaged about it. So that's my experience. It's really like training and then the relational stuff in circles.
Awesome. That's really, really helpful, Lissy. And I think something that was really emphasized through the weekend about all of that too was how much that was just a baseline. Like, we are going to do storytelling and resonance every day throughout this training, and establishing practices as a part of the culture of the space that also were contributing to greater vulnerability and connection amongst participants, often who didn't know each other. So we were all starting off the day sitting with 2 other people we didn't know, telling a story about what brought us to the space, the challenges we overcome, and the support that we received in going through that challenge, and then resonating with each other, which means reflecting back moments to the listener when you felt moved by their story or when you felt like you were there with them. And it's not a moment to share like, oh, that happened to me too, or this is what I think's wrong with you and diagnosing a problem, but more of like sharing those moments when you feel connected. And that is a practice or a tool that's been developed by obviously for thousands of years, but more specifically shared as a tool by the Relational Center, which is really incredible, based out of LA. Awesome. So I know Becca has a comment that's unrelated, so I'll pass it to you, Becca, to share with us. What are you thinking about?
Well, I was just thinking about how complicated and also like beautiful of an opportunity that we are in right now, which is that so much of what divestment is rooted in and what creates common ground is running a campaign centered on the same tactic, and what it looks like to like build a culture out of a tactic rather than building a culture out of like a shared analysis. And even though it's I think a lot of successful organizations build their DNA out of a really shared analysis, there's something really awesome about the opportunity to build DNA from a shared tactic, because there's people who are sitting at a table together that might not have always been able to, that are like, no, we are like working on divestment campaigns, this is really valuable. And I think I shared this with some folks before, but there's a lot of people who came to the table around divestment nationally in the US and beyond who didn't do organizing before, and what it looks like to build a movement that's centered around like bringing people into organizing that have never done it before. And like Jason, who I'm sitting in a room with. And so thinking about like how do you build a DNA that cultivates that kind of space, and how can we like analyze what happened in the divestment movement to have learnings around what's worked and what's been challenging.
Yeah, that was something that came up for us in the presentation around vision, function, values that we did to the training space, where I think it was, definitely unusual to have what cohered us and brought us together as a shared tactic. But on the other hand, I think, there's something exciting about starting from a place of knowing what your tools are and then being able to grow out from there. And we talked about that transition of being defined not just by the tactic, but also ways to clearly say we're united because of what we stand for, not just the tools that we're using. And so seeing that as a place of growth that we're excited to be heading towards.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I think I think sometimes we forget that there is like shared analysis behind it. And I think I was even doing this, which is that like we are all have shared alignment that like the fossil fuel industry has like wreaked so much havoc that like it has to go. And this is a tactic that like allows us to access a pillar of power that is really important to take down. But what does it mean that we like center our tactic more than our analysis, even in the way that we talk about it? And I do that. And what does it look like to like recenter and deepen that in the way that we like tell stories and build our organizations?
Yeah, I think that's hugely crucial. And it was really crazy to stand in the front of the room of like, I don't know, how many people were there, like 100 people, and try and describe what exactly are we trying to do. And it was really scary. I volunteered us to do that. I'm sorry, everybody. Everyone was like, God damn it, Jess. But it was actually really useful because I realized that this group of people who I work with fairly regularly, who are all in pretty solid positions in the organization and various different positions in the organization, we had never said together, like, this is our vision, like, this is the function of the DSN. And I think it's easier for us to name our values and the things that we believe and our like political analysis, but like what actually is the DSN here to accomplish, and what is our role in our movement ecology is something that's less clearly defined, and there are multiple answers to it. And I say that not with judgment, but more in the fact that I think it's exciting to be moving towards a place of real clarity about claiming the power that we have as a movement and an organization, and getting really specific about what we want to accomplish and strategizing around how to make that happen. Jason, I know that you shared some thoughts before in describing that process of getting clear vision, function, values. Do you want to say anything more about what that was like for you?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I remember different questions being posed to us by Carlos and maybe even the audience or the other participants in the training. And I remember us having totally different answers to some of those questions. I mean, us as members of the DSN. And that was very illuminating for me, I think. That was just very illuminating. Because I realized at that moment, like, oh, we actually totally have, like, somewhat different visions for, like, what we think this is about or what we think it's going or whatever. And I felt at that time that the conversation hadn't been had, or at least it hadn't been had enough. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So that was very interesting at the training, and yeah, I think that I'll say that.
One of the ways in which that was that kind of dynamic, one phrase that was used a lot was so many of us spend time working in our organization but not on our organization. And I think that was the kind of moment where that became apparent to us is we've spent the last 2 years trying to just get this organization off the ground, from all the different aspects that it involves, the outreach to like the mundane, okay, do we have a fiscal sponsor, to what's our like leadership structure, all of those questions. But in doing so much more of that sort of mechanical parts of it, it's easy to sort of neglect the like, okay, what is all of this for, and actually zooming out to have those questions. And so I think that was an important push, to step out of sort of the we're working in the organization to like, okay, we're going to step back and work on the organization and step into clarity about what is the purpose of all of this. And this is related, but not quite. I think also like, how do we sit in that sweet spot of recognizing diversity as a strength and not wanting to just have like monolithic groupthink, but also the necessity of alignment and not just actually headed in divergent directions. And so how do we find kind of what that how do we sit in the middle of those two things? And so I think all of that was really revealed in about a 5-minute span, which was challenging and also extremely useful.
Yeah, definitely. I think the point about diversity is really something that I'd love to dig into more, and was mentioned multiple times throughout the course of the weekend, that diversity is our greatest strength, and that it's not about imposing some sort of like homogeneous culture, but there is a difference between homogeneity and unity, and like needing to have a united understanding or alignment around a set of values that guide the way that we want to develop our culture, our way of organizing together, and that our structure then informs, or function then informs our structure. I think it's really important. And I think that concept is kind of confusing for me, because when I think about scaling up a movement or a culture, it seems inherent to me that in doing that, you ultimately sacrifice to the dilution of scale and of creating something that spreads really rapidly. And how much do you have to give up in order to allow it to be simple enough to be disseminated? And yet, I know it was emphasized also that like heterogeneity could be the culture that you spread, and that could be front-loaded into your movement DNA. And so, question for you, Lissy, and we'd also love to hear from Sachi and Jason, who are also there. What is your understanding of how to make that possible? How to include the need for diversity and heterogeneity in your movement DNA as you're going through the process of front loading?
One of the ways that we thought about this was in terms of meta-narrative, and Smucker really supported us in thinking about that in terms of the spectrum of support. What we discovered was that that the Jewish community is extremely heterogeneous, and every single time we tried to come up with something to say about it, somebody was like, "That's wrong." So we had to create a very kind of like capacious like scaffolding of a meta-narrative, basically. Like, we couldn't even come up with something that would be 1 page long because it would already be wrong. Like, it had to be something as like poetic and simple as like the 3 questions of like, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? I mean, that really became like the guiding structure of our meta-narrative. And it meant that we had to be really mindful in creating, I mean, I'm sure Becca knows about this stuff too, not to assume that you know everything that your partner knows, but like I think that understanding that for us to create an identity of an us, we also had to create a them. So this is all like Smucker TM stuff, but like maybe you guys can get a sweet deal on it. It was just really, really fucking helpful. I mean, the 4 hours that we spent with him were the best 4 hours that we spent working on meta-narrative stuff. So I really can't recommend it highly enough in terms of thinking about how to front-load heterogeneity into the meta-narrative work. I think in terms of, what did I want to say about structure and strategy? So what do you guys feel like, the other pieces around strategy, obviously, there needs to be a heterogeneity of identities of all different kinds in the movement, but there can't really be heterogeneity at a certain level around strategy. There needs to be a single strategic objective. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about what the quandary is around heterogeneity and how that relates also to structure specifically, if that's what you're thinking, or if it really is more of a story or a strategy issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the huge questions, right? Is like, in an organization, you can hold many programs, many projects, but in a mass movement, like, how much tactical diversity can you really have? And I think that that's something that we're thinking a lot about in the DSN as we're diving more fully into the reinvestment network as a partner in the reinvestment network, which is working on a whole new campaign that's very much related to what we've been doing with divestment, and in some ways is like the next phase of that work. But yeah, understanding like what are the differences in our roles in that versus in divestment, how much can we hold those things in conjunction with each other or not? And what are the limits in terms of scale and building a mass movement around tactics or around a particular DNA in holding those things together? And Sachi is working really directly on that, so I don't know if you want to add anything. Yeah, sorry, go for it, Lissy.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, the question of, there's one question about tactics, which is meta-narrative, which is like, can you target the public and bring the public into a movement who declares itself as a divestment movement, like who says that in a sense, like, its cause, its whole reason for being is embodied in a tactic. And then there's like a strategic question, which is like, what is the diversity of tactics that you need? And I think that for us, and if not now, it's been really freeing to be able to give people a bare bones strategy that then people can use all different kinds of tactics of non-cooperation within. And I think that part of what makes a strategy really resonant, like what makes Cosecha's strategy really resonant and made us realize that ours wasn't, and we had to work on it a lot more, is that people really need to feel that there's an intuitive way that they can withdraw consent. Like, if you take the social view of power to heart, what it also means is that people need to understand what they're already doing, that they need to stop doing. And so for some of us, that means what we're doing right now is being silent. We're consenting to a kind of silence, and it means that we need to withdraw our support from that by speaking up. But it also means that there's a variety of other tactics, whether it's like walking out of institutions that we're a part of and things that you guys have already thought a lot about. So I would say that like those are the two questions. Yeah, I would say those are the two questions. Like strategically, is it wise to limit it to a tactic? And I'm sure there are many tactics within that around divestment. Like, what does it mean what does economic non-cooperation really look like? What does it mean to take our money out of a system in a whole variety of ways? I mean, there's a whole spectrum of things that you can do. But then I think there's the other piece around like meta-narrative, which is just like, how does the public respond to that tactic being central? Right. There's lots of pillars. There's lots of institutions that can consent in a lot of different ways. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for those of you who are watching, Becca just chatted. What does it look like for universities to withdraw consent from the fossil fuel industry? Do you want to ask?
Jason just made a good point to me. Also, he was like, divestment isn't just a tactic; it's a campaign, which is true. It's like how we use lots of tactics to win our divestment campaigns. Divestment is a tactic that we are pushing universities to use to withdraw their consent from the fossil fuel industry. And so, like, what does it look like to have a broader set of like asks that isn't just centering divestment, but is actually centering this like broader theory of change around like universities withdrawing consent from an industry in particular? Or is our story bigger than that, and what does it look like to tell that story?
Josh, did you want to add something to that?
I was going to go back to the heterogeneity piece, though I think this question is really awesome. So if anyone else wants to engage this question of consent theory of power, we can sit here. Otherwise, I'm happy to shift. Cool. I was just going to say one, like, in this question that Jess was posing around, as we decentralize, sometimes it necessitates that we simplify, whereas like a more centralized organization can hold more sort of complexity of programs, whatever diversity of strategies. And a phrase that I've just been thinking about that I honestly don't remember where it came from, but that I heard that I've been thinking a lot about is breadth without depth is diluted, and depth without breadth is irrelevant. And I think that's like something that I was thinking about a lot during this process of decentralization is right now the DSN actually is a fairly centralized organization with not that many staff and a lot of programs. And as we move into a more decentralized model, how do we not sacrifice the depth? And I think that's why the front-loading process is especially important, is because we can, when we're clear about what that depth is and insist on it from the beginning, we can go through the process rather than, okay, we're going to build out this structure and then but we don't really know what it's for, and it becomes kind of loose and people don't know that they're fighting for the same things as other people in that network, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's part of this process right now, is figuring out how to navigate that and recognize that we need breadth and depth. But as we go through this stretching, how to hold the depth through it all.
Does anyone want to respond to that? I think that's a really crucial point. Yeah, I think in particular that also brings back to me the importance of thinking about function and vision and values before designating structure. And in a lot of ways, the DSN has gone in the other direction and created a regional structure that then we fill with our programs and the work that we want to be doing. and also to bring together student campaigns who are really fighting on the ground for divestment. And so it's this question of like chicken and the egg kind of situation, and how do we like ensure that as we grow and as we expand, we have the potency of our vision and of our strategies and the principles that we want to be organizing around to be held fully amongst the people who are a part of our organization and our movement. I'm curious, Lucy, if you want to comment on that in relation to, if not now, and if y'all had similar fears around creating something so intentionally and now starting to disseminate that through mass training. What are your thoughts or concerns or considerations as you're starting to bring more and more and more people into the set of values, tactics, the DNA that you believe so strongly in?
I mean, I think the thing we felt grateful for is that we're not in a moment of the whirlwind, and it's more of a rollout than a launch. I mean, I think in our vision a year ago, we were like, man, we're going to finish the DNA, and that is it. Other people are going to take the movement. I'm never going to be a part of this again. And it's been, like, slow and laborious rolling it out. So we've had a lot of opportunities to troubleshoot things, and we are just now, honestly, getting into thinking about things like decision-making process at, like, a large scale. Like, you would think that would have been thought about 8 months ago, but we're just thinking about it now and having a retreat with Brooke this week. So, I mean, I think... yeah, it's felt like there's been a lot of space for us to troubleshoot things, and we all felt like controlling and like we didn't want to give it away, but knew that the only thing that would make the last year of sacrifice worthwhile would be if we did it. So also everybody really needed to rest. So there was that, and then the other thing I just wanted to mention that I think is interesting about what you guys are talking about that I identify with as part of F Not Now is that we weren't building a movement that was targeting the entire public. I don't know. I guess what I would say is, like, strategically it was a challenge for us to think about what does it mean for us to target just a segment of the public, knowing that that changes like the broader picture or whatever, and like how does the strategy and the story have to reflect that, I guess. So I don't actually have any insights about that. I just wanted to say that I kind of resonated with the challenge of trying to build a movement that wasn't like a full Paul was like, I don't even know what it's going to look like for you guys to do this because the whole public isn't really a part of it. And it's like, well, the whole public actually hears about it. They're just like they're not as strategic of a location as whatever. So that's all I'll say about that. I don't know if other people want to add something about yeah, what you're asking.
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear, Lissy, and I'm glad that y'all are getting a chance to take a break also, and that you didn't have to launch in the midst of movement peak craziness. I'd love to hear what everyone else is thinking, in particular, if Maya or Silver have any questions for us or for Lissy in our last remaining 10 minutes together.
I don't know if this is like too bare bones a question, but I guess like what I'm left with feeling uncertain about is just kind of like what exactly is next, and what exactly of this has DSN actually done, and like how, like, who in DSN should be doing this, and like I just think like a lot of that's still really up in the air, and I don't know if that's just my perspective or if that's just the reality, and just kind of trying to figure out the next steps of like in terms of doing like DNA stuff and integrating these things, like how we've already kind of grown into this like really structured organization, and like we've gotten there's a lot of people involved like through the regional networks and stuff like that, and like how just like figuring out the balance with centralization and decentralization to have a process to go about that, and I'm just really curious what those conversations have looked like, or what everyone here thinks of that in regards to DSN.
Totally. That is, yeah, that's a really super legit question, and you're not like completely out of the loop. I'm really glad that you asked that. So I'll take a stab at it because I've been doing some work with Allison around long-term strategy stuff, and then I'd love Sachi and Jason to add anything else. Basically, where it's at right now is after going to this training, those of us who attended the training, plus Sarah and Will in particular, got really excited about thinking about these ideas and about front loading, and had a number of conversations with folks like Lissy and other people from the If Not Now movement, from Cosecha, about what their processes looked like and what is possible in terms of hybridization, the application of some of the swarm methodology, and just broader front-loading technology in relation to the work that we're doing in the DSN, particularly knowing that we have a movement that we don't own entirely, right? Like the DSN is one piece of the divestment movement, which is one piece of a broader climate justice movement. And so for us to front load, what is our role in that? Like what is our piece of the movement ecology that is really a clear view of our function, right? And understanding that in order to really get clear about where we're going next, I think is a huge component of that. And also knowing that because our movement is in progress, divestment campaigns are running, we can't totally pull the plug on everything that's going on right now to create something completely new, unless we want to step out of the DSN, unless we want to end the DSN as we know it and let the rest of the divestment movement kind of do its thing, right? But I actually think the DSN plays a really crucial role in the divestment movement, and that we shouldn't just pull the plug on the work that we're doing right now and the programs we're running. I think the organizing that we're doing with young folks around climate justice work is really crucial. And so what does it look like to do some front loading in the midst of continuing to run at least a portion of our programs and continuing to function? So there's still a lot up in the air about those questions. What does a hybrid model look like? What does it mean to move this process forward and answer those questions? Who are the people to do that? And Allison, as coordinator of long-term strategy, is really the person who's going to be moving a lot of those big conversations forward. Some of those things we will be talking about at the PST, the Program Support Team and Coordinating Committee retreat this weekend in Boston. But I think in response to your question about decentralization and centralization in the midst of kind of bringing in new DNA or intervening in culture, something that I thought was really useful during the Swarm weekend was that in an existing movement, if you're trying to intervene or create something new intentionally, that more centralization is actually important, in that you have a core team of people who are going to be carrying that process forward. And so that's what the folks in If Not Now did. That's what the folks in Cosecha did. And so similarly, regardless of the variety of tools we'll be incorporating in our long-term strategy process, we do want to create a core team of people who can carry that the process forward with consultation and information gathering from people beyond that. And we're hoping that to have a lot of students in it and kind of like a diversity of people from our movement, and people who are going to be carrying the work forward in the future too. So some of that might still feel really vague, but does that start to answer your question at all, Maya? Cool. Sachi and Jason, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I definitely have something. I think there's two things, and one thing is like, what is the vision of the DSN? Where is the DSN going? You know what I mean? And that's one thing. So it's like, have we done that? Are we figuring that? And I think like really like maybe we've kind of started to do it, but just to be clear, like we haven't done any of this stuff, right? Like we haven't done any front loading. We haven't like we haven't really embarked on this process. We want to maybe, but we haven't really done that. And then the other one to me is decision making. You know what I mean? It's like who gets to decide what the vision is, what the organization looks like, whatever. Like, do people in the regional networks get to decide since they're part of the organization, or no? And so I think like there's not really an answer to that question. This is like I don't think that's like written out. Yep, this is the people that like, right? So I think honestly the answer to that question right now is to be determined. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that trying to build alignment around the vision that we have and getting clear about our strategic objective and the function that we hold in our movement ecology is like a really key part of that. And though it may be a more centralized group of people who make specific decisions about it, I think that there's definitely an intention to bring like as many folks who are a part of the organization, who have a stake in the success of it, into that process. And I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm excited to keep thinking about it and know that like we really want to bring in and hear people's thoughts about what that should look like. So I'd love to hear like if you have ideas about what it looks like for you to be a part of those conversations in some way, and a variety of people outside of the PST and the CC. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to check with you, Silver, if you have any questions or reflections that you want to share with us. Been talking about a lot of stuff. Okay, Silver says not at the moment. Awesome. Totally, yeah, processing, so real. I know that we presented a lot of concepts tonight and got into a bunch of big questions, which I'm really excited to hold and continue to dig into together in other spaces. But I just wanted to thank all of you for getting on tonight, and to Sachi and Jason and Varsh for being on to help present, and for Lissy answering our questions and being super supportive through the process of us swirling in all of these big ideas and trying to think about how they relate to our work. I'm super grateful. And thank you to Maya and Silver and Becca for being engaged participants, and anybody else who's watching. I think that's all we have for now. I really encourage you all to keep track of the things that you're processing, the reflections you have, and particularly other questions that come up for you as you continue mulling all of this over. We have a document with some of the key learnings that we gained from the training that we can share with y'all, as well as a PDF of some of the definitions of terms from the SWARM training and principles of decentralization from INE Institute. So I will send those all out to you in an email. And if you have further questions, make sure to send them my way, and we'll try and carry this conversation forward. Jason, Sachi, Lissy, anything to add? Go for it, Jason.
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, cool. Well, great. Thanks so much, y'all, and have a really great night, and we'll see you on soon. Take care.